August 1945. The war is won. Churchill stands before cheering crowds in Trafalgar Square. Britain has survived the Blitz, defeated Hitler, and saved civilization itself. But in the Treasury building just blocks away, John Maynard Keynes stares at a balance sheet that tells a different story. Britain is bankrupt. Not struggling, bankrupt. The empire that once financed the world can't afford to feed its own people for more than 6 weeks. The American Lend-Lease program that kept Britain alive is about to end, and Washington wants payment. What happened next would transform Britain from global superpower to junior partner, and the bill for victory would take 60 years to pay. This is the story they don't teach you: how America used World War II to bankrupt the British Empire. To understand how Britain went from the world's banker to beggar, we need to go back to September 1939. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, it was still the world's largest creditor nation. The pound sterling backed a quarter of global trade. British investments in America alone totaled $4.5 billion, equivalent to roughly $95 billion today. Britain owned railroads in Argentina, rubber plantations in Malaysia, oil fields in Persia, and held massive gold reserves. The sun never set on British capital. But Winston Churchill knew something the cheering crowds didn't. Britain couldn't fight a modern war and remain a great power. The choice was stark: defeat Hitler or keep the empire. You couldn't do both. The problem was industrial capacity. In 1939, Britain could produce about 2,000 aircraft per year. Germany was producing 8,000. Britain's factories were old, its coal mines depleting, its workforce too small. To fight a mechanized war against the Nazi war machine, Britain needed American factories. It needed American steel, American oil, American planes, and American guns. And America, still neutral, wanted payment in full. Cash on the barrel. No credit, no loans, no favors. President Roosevelt had signed the Neutrality Acts that banned loans to warring nations. The memory of unpaid World War I debts still burned in Congress. If Britain wanted American weapons, Britain would pay American prices up front. This was the cash and carry policy, and it was designed to strip Britain bare. Between September 1939 and March 1941, Britain spent every liquid asset it had. The Treasury sold $2 billion in American securities, equivalent to $42 billion today. British companies with U.S. operations were forced to sell. Courtaulds, the textile giant, sold its American subsidiary at a massive loss. Shell Oil divested its American holdings. Lever Brothers sold out. The British government seized these private assets from its own citizens and liquidated them to buy bullets. One by one, the crown jewels of the British Empire were auctioned off to American buyers at fire sale prices. But it wasn't enough. By December 1940, Churchill sent Roosevelt a desperate letter. Britain had exactly $2 billion left in gold and dollars. At current spending rates, that would last 3 months. After that, the war was over. Not because of German victories, but because Britain couldn't afford ammunition. Churchill wrote, "The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies." It was the most expensive begging letter ever written. Roosevelt faced a dilemma. If Britain fell, America would face Nazi Germany alone. But Congress would never approve a loan. The political solution was Lend-Lease, announced in March 1941. Roosevelt sold it to the American public with a homely metaphor. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him your garden hose. You don't demand payment while the house burns. You settle up after. But Lend-Lease was never a loan in any normal sense. It was a calculated transfer of power disguised as generosity. The terms were brutal, written to ensure that Britain would emerge from the war economically subordinate to the United States. Think of it this way: America would provide unlimited supplies to Britain, but Britain had to agree never to use those supplies to compete with American exports. Britain couldn't use American steel to build ships for export. Couldn't use American oil to undercut American petroleum. Couldn't rebuild its export industries with American materials. Lend-Lease kept Britain fighting, but it dismantled Britain's post-war economic independence in the process. The numbers tell the story. Between 1941 and 1945, America provided Britain with $31.4 billion in Lend-Lease aid. In today's money, that's approximately $560 billion. Ships, planes, tanks, food, oil, everything needed to fight. Britain received 17.5 million tons of food under Lend-Lease. Without it, the islands would have starved. But here's what they don't tell you. Britain was simultaneously forced to continue paying for anything America classified as non-military. Tobacco? Pay cash. Cotton? Pay cash. Machine tools for civilian factories? Pay cash. America drew the line wherever it maximized British dependence. And there was a poison pill buried in Article VII of the Lend-Lease Agreement. Britain had to agree to eliminate its system of Imperial Preference, the tariff system that gave British colonies favorable trade terms with London. For 2 centuries, Imperial Preference was the glue holding the British Empire together. India bought British textiles, Canada sold Britain wheat, Australia provided wool, all at preferential rates that excluded American competition. Article VII demanded Britain dismantle this system after the war. The price of survival was the empire itself. Churchill knew it. His advisors knew it. They signed anyway because the alternative was German occupation. But Lend-Lease wasn't even free during the war. America demanded collateral, and Britain handed over the keys to the empire. In 1940, Britain transferred 50 obsolete destroyers from America in exchange for 99-year leases on military bases in Bermuda, the Bahamas, Jamaica, Antigua, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. These bases gave America strategic control of the Atlantic and Caribbean. Britain lost sovereignty over its own territories to get weapons it desperately needed. Then came the gold. In 1940, Britain secretly shipped $7 billion in gold bullion, about $148 billion today, from London to Canada and then to Fort Knox. This wasn't payment. It was ransom. America held British gold as security against Lend-Lease shipments. The real devastation happened to Britain's overseas investments. In 1939, Britain's foreign investments generated £200 million per year in income, equivalent to £15 billion annually today. These investments were the foundation of British wealth, the dividends of empire accumulated over 3 centuries. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain liquidated approximately £1.5 billion in overseas assets, equivalent to £90 billion today. American assets went first sold at Depression-era prices. Then South American railroads sold to local governments. Then Asian rubber plantations, petroleum interests, mining operations. Britain sold the family silver to buy ammunition, and American negotiators made sure the prices were low. One Treasury official described it as picking the British carcass. By 1945, Britain's foreign investments had fallen from £3.5 billion to £2 billion, a loss of 43% of the empire's capital base. But that's not the whole story. During the same period, Britain had been forced to borrow from its own colonies to finance the war. India, Egypt, and other colonies provided goods and services to Britain, and instead of paying in pounds, Britain issued IOUs. These sterling balances totaled £3.5 billion by 1945, equivalent to £210 billion today. Britain owed its own empire more than the empire's investments were worth. The colonies had become creditors, and London couldn't pay. India alone held £1.3 billion in sterling balances. Money Britain promised but couldn't deliver. This debt became one of the triggers for decolonization. Why stay in an empire that owes you billions it will never repay? Then came August 1945. On August 17th, President Truman signed an executive order terminating Lend-Lease, effective immediately. Not winding down, terminated. Ships already at sea were ordered to turn around. Goods in American ports were impounded. The tap was shut off without warning. Britain was still fighting Japan when the announcement came. The war wasn't over, but America's patience was exhausted. The British government panicked. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would run out of food in 6 weeks. The nation that had fed the world through its empire couldn't feed itself. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's most brilliant economist, was dispatched to Washington to negotiate an emergency loan. He was 62 years old, in poor health, and about to face the most humiliating negotiation in British history. Keynes asked for $6 billion as a grant, not a loan. His argument was simple. Britain had bankrupted itself fighting a common enemy while America profited from war production. Britain deserved aid as compensation for fighting alone from 1939 to 1941. The Americans laughed him out of the room. The chief American negotiator, William Clayton, told Keynes that Congress would never approve a grant. Britain would get a loan on commercial terms or nothing at all. Keynes cabled back to London. "This is a poker game and we must play it coolly." But Britain had no cards to play. The negotiations dragged on for 3 months. Britain needed the money immediately, but America had time. Every week Britain weakened. American negotiators demanded more concessions. They wanted the pound made convertible to dollars. They wanted all trade restrictions lifted. They wanted the end of Imperial Preference. They wanted Britain to open its markets completely to American goods. Keynes called the American demands a Carthaginian peace. The Americans didn't care. Britain would accept the terms or face mass starvation and industrial collapse. On December 6, 1945, the Anglo-American Loan Agreement was signed. Britain would receive $3.75 billion at 2% interest, equivalent to about $62 billion today. The loan would be repaid over 50 years, starting in 1951. But attached to the loan were conditions that would devastate Britain's economy. First, the pound had to become freely convertible to dollars by July 1947. This meant anyone holding pounds could demand dollars at a fixed rate, draining Britain's currency reserves. Second, Britain had to eliminate all trade restrictions and imperial preference within 1 year. Third, Britain had to accept American oversight of its economic policy. Keynes knew these terms would cripple Britain, but the alternative was immediate economic collapse. Britain was being financially occupied by its own ally. The loan was just the beginning. Britain also had to settle its Lend-Lease account. American negotiators valued the undestroyed Lend-Lease equipment remaining in British hands at $20 billion. Britain had to pay for equipment it had been told was lent. After intense negotiations, the bill was reduced to $650 million, about $10.8 billion today. But this meant Britain owed America a total of $4.4 billion, $72 billion in modern terms, immediately after winning the most expensive war in history. For comparison, the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe and is celebrated as generous American aid, provided $13 billion to all of Europe. Britain alone owed nearly a third of that amount to America. The consequences were immediate and brutal. In July 1947, Britain made the pound convertible as required. Within 5 weeks, Britain's dollar reserves hemorrhaged. Everyone with pounds demanded dollars. Britain lost $1 billion in gold and dollar reserves in 6 weeks. On August 20, 1947, the government suspended convertibility, violating the loan agreement. Britain had lasted 42 days before admitting the American terms were impossible. The economy was in free fall. Food rationing, which had eased slightly after the war, was tightened. Bread was rationed for the first time in British history, not during the war but after it. In 1948, rations were smaller than in 1944. Britain was starving in peacetime. The government implemented austerity measures that would last for a decade. Imports were slashed. Civilian industries were starved of resources. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, operated in crumbling hospitals with antiquated equipment. Housing construction stalled as steel was diverted to exports. Britain needed to export or die, but it had nothing to sell. Its factories were obsolete, its workforce exhausted, its capital depleted. Meanwhile, Germany and Japan, the defeated Axis powers, received Marshall Plan aid with no strings attached. They rebuilt their industries with American grants while Britain paid back American loans with interest. The debt became an albatross around Britain's neck for generations. Britain made payments of approximately £43 million per year starting in 1951. The original loan of $3.75 billion with interest would eventually total $7.5 billion to repay. Britain made its final payment on December 29, 2006, 61 years after the loan was signed. The war that ended in 1945 wasn't truly over for Britain until the 21st century. In total, Britain paid approximately $10.5 billion over 6 decades for the privilege of defeating Hitler while America sat out the first 2 years. But the financial cost was trivial compared to the strategic consequences. The loan conditions forced Britain to dismantle Imperial Preference in 1948, collapsing the economic logic of empire. If Canadian wheat had no tariff advantage in London, why ship it across the Atlantic? If Indian textiles couldn't enter Britain duty-free, why manufacture them for export to Britain? The empire's trade system disintegrated. Between 1945 and 1965, Britain granted independence to most of its colonies, not primarily because of anti-colonial movements, but because maintaining empire was no longer profitable. The sterling area collapsed. The pound, once the world's reserve currency, was devalued in 1949 and again in 1967. By 1971, Britain abandoned the gold standard completely. The dollar replaced the pound as the world's currency. Britain's century as global financial hegemon was over. America benefited from every aspect of Britain's decline. American companies bought British assets at depression prices. American exports flooded British markets once Imperial Preference ended. American military bases in former British territories became the foundation of a global network that exists today. The special relationship between America and Britain, celebrated as alliance and partnership, was actually the relationship between creditor and debtor, between dominant power and client state. Britain became America's aircraft carrier in Europe, useful but subordinate. The most bitter irony is this: Britain's financial collapse was avoidable. If America had provided genuine grants instead of loans, if Lend-Lease had come without conditions, if the 1945 loan hadn't included convertibility requirements, Britain could have maintained much of its global position. But American policy was explicitly designed to supplant British power. Dean Acheson, who would become Secretary of State, said in 1945, "Britain has lost an empire and not yet found a role. America made sure Britain never found that role." Documents declassified in the 1970s revealed that American negotiators deliberately imposed harsh terms to accelerate British decline. The goal wasn't just to help Britain survive the war. It was to ensure America inherited Britain's empire. In less than 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, Britain went from the world's largest creditor to its biggest debtor. The war cost Britain approximately £7 billion directly, equivalent to £420 billion today. But the total cost, including lost investments, accumulated debts, and decades of interest payments, exceeded £30 billion, about £1.8 trillion in modern terms. Britain liquidated 3 centuries of accumulated wealth in 6 years. The empire that once ruled a quarter of the globe was reduced to a mid-sized European power struggling to pay its heating bills. And for 60 years afterward, every British taxpayer sent a portion of their income to American banks as payment for the privilege of having defeated fascism. The official story says Britain won World War II. The financial records tell a different story. Britain survived, but it paid a price that makes victory look a lot like defeat. America emerged from the war as the world's dominant power not because its soldiers were braver, but because its accountants were sharper. The real weapon that won the war wasn't the atomic bomb, it was the loan agreement. Today, when we talk about the special relationship between Britain and America, remember, it was built on a foundation of debt extraction and the calculated dismantling of British power. The bill for 1945 was finally paid in 2006, but Britain never recovered what it lost. The empire ended not with revolution or military defeat, but with a balance sheet that could no longer balance. This video was created using AI-assisted research and scriptwriting. While every effort has been made to ensure historical accuracy, viewers are encouraged to conduct their own research on these historical events.